Durkheim tried to convince his readers that correlations with the positions of the heavenly bodies, or with the climate, or with the presence in the population of certain races or sub-races were all spurious. But then again, there were also a few correlations that remained strong. There is, according to Durkheim, an undeniable relationship between religion and suicide rates. There is a relationship between being married or being single and suicide rates. There is a relationship between the stability of people's economic position and suicide rates. And there is also a relationship with the sector of society in which people are working and suicide rates. Those correlations, he says, cannot be explained away. Although we shouldn't forget that the technical means that Durkheim had at his disposal to analyze those correlations were still pretty primitive. Building on those observations, Durkheim now constructs his own sociological explanation. The suicide rate is a characteristic of a social collective. It's a social fact. And if you want to explain this social fact, you should look out for other social facts. Now, social cohesion, the strength of the social web, may explain some of the regularities in the figures. Why are the suicide rates for married people, for example, lower than for singles? Well, married people are bound with stronger ties to society than single people. A similar argument can be used in explaining differences between religious groups. The social cohesion amongst the Jews is higher than the social cohesion amongst the Protestants, let alone the atheists. So it comes as no surprise that we find a higher suicide rate amongst the non-believers than amongst the people of the Jewish faith, the faith of Durkheim's own ancestors. The rise in suicide rates that is attended by a gradual lowering of social cohesion is called by Durkheim egoistic suicide. I do not like that term at all. It's quite misleading. Sometimes people say that somebody who committed suicide did something very selfish, very egoistical, that they didn't think of the pain of those who were left behind. And whether you sympathize with that kind of argument or not, this is not at all what Durkheim had in mind when he used that word egoistic suicide. For him, it's just a technical term to classify the rising suicide rates that we find in modern societies where the social cohesion is in a process of weakening. Now remember that in his book on the division of social labor, Durkheim had defended the idea that modern societies do not lack social solidarity, that it is only created in another way, that organic solidarity is the outcome of the interdependence that comes with more differentiation and specialization. In the final part of that early work, Durkheim already began to subtly change his tone, and now, in the book on suicide, he seems to take his distance from the arguments in his first book. He now states that social cohesion is low in modern Western societies, and that this tendency makes it very difficult to protect the people in those societies from the type of suicide that he calls egoistic. Durkheim may have been afraid that his readers would conclude from his argument that we should always strive for the highest degree of social cohesion imaginable. And he wants to convince us that he favors optimum cohesion, not maximum cohesion. And to do that, he says that when social cohesion is extremely strong, that also might lead to a rise in suicide rates. He calls this altruistic suicide, using a word, by the way, that was also coined by Auguste Comte, l'altruisme, altruism. And again, I think it's a bit of a misleading term. An example that he gives here is the soldier who sacrifices his life in a suicide attack because he cannot conceive of himself as a separate individual anymore. His personality seems to have dissolved into the group. Durkheim says that this kind of behavior has almost disappeared from modern Western Europe, where people have a very strong sense of individuality. So altruistic suicide is not such an important category, it's a small category, but it has a theoretical purpose. In fact, Durkheim is mainly interested in the so-called egoistic suicide, because that is so closely tied up with the rise of modernity in Western Europe. But there is also another type of suicide that he considers to be very important, and that is anomic suicide.